We are going to energise the country.
We need to wake up and smell the coffee.
No more Mr. Nice Guy.
Another future's possible, but we've got to fight for it.
Order!
Hello and welcome to the Debated podcast. As always, I'm your host, Will. And in this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by a returning guest, this time in a new guise as a candidate rather than an activist, Nathan Boroda, who is the Labour Party's candidate for Unsworth ward at next year's council elections. Welcome back to the podcast, Nathan.
Thanks, Will. Great to be back in a regenerated capacity.
Not too much of a change, though, thankfully.
Indeed.
So the first question that I'd like to ask is, what do you think are going to be the main issues at next year's council elections?
Definitely. So I think the main one will be COVID recovery. This crisis has defined our lives for the past 6 months, and sadly, I think will do for the next 6 months too. And it's about, across boroughs across the country, who do we want to rebuild our boroughs? Who do we want to rebuild our towns? And, we have the slogan of Build Back Better. It's been on the left for a couple of months now, and Boris Johnson's co-opted it, which is fine. It shows our hegemony, if you like. But Labour have been putting together these policies and values right from the start about, the role of the state rather than privatising it like Serco. So I do think the COVID recovery will be important. I think people will trust us on that because of the values and policies we've shown in the past 6 months. Equally, I think the environment will be a really important issue. I think we've seen that really increase in its kind of salience in the past year or so. I think people want to know on a local level what their councils are doing in terms of the environment. In Bury, we've got a really strong track record on that we really want to showcase to the ward. So I'd say COVID recovery and environment, and also, I guess, in terms of working with other autonomous bodies, so like the Greater Manchester Mayor, Andy Burnham's up for re-election this year. How do we make sure we do things at Greater Manchester level? And equally, how do we relate to government? And, this government has massively underfunded councils, particularly in the north. And how do we fight for a fair deal for our constituents?
Now, you mentioned, obviously, coronavirus there. I mean, how do you think that the government have handled it? And how do you think that they've handled the link between local government and government at Westminster? Do you think there's been enough communication, or do you think that the Westminster government haven't communicated enough with regional councils, like, for example, in Greater Manchester?
Definitely. So the short answer to that is no. I don't think they have communicated enough. Although, looking back to February, you think this is an unprecedented crisis. Let's start with that. And no government could have found this easy. There's inevitably going to be difficult decisions. And I look back to February and I think, bloody hell, I don't envy Boris. I don't envy this government for doing that. And so I started from that position of good faith, of trying to see, what can they do right, which I'm sure, a few things like the furlough scheme, Nightingale hospitals, etc. And all with that considered, you do think that so many of the things they've done have been wrong, unfortunately, for this country and not in the national interest. So the failure to lock down soon enough, the failure to ask the proper questions that would have led to us locking down before the 23rd of March. If you think about Greece locking down on the 5th, it would have saved so many lives and actually helped the economy too, because it would have shortened the time that we would have needed to lock down for until what ended up being June. The whole Dominic Cummings affair, which really undermined public trust, the testing regime, which had never properly scaled up. And again, it's an example of what I'm going to talk about later about centralising, the privatised track and trace, appointing someone like Daniel Harding with very limited skills, all the related fiascos like the A-level saga. Really shows a government that hasn't understood, hasn't got to grips with the level of the crisis, and has an ideology that is, it's the neoliberalism that takes you towards this privatisation. It's so rotten that it's failing so many people in this country. And then in relation to local councils, this government has an extraordinary tendency to centralise everything into kind of one small room in Downing Street. That's Dom and his mates. They run the country. And, this is a government with a 43%, 44, mid-40% of the country voted for the general election. Obviously, that's enough in the constitutional terms to get a majority. I'm not denying that. But it's not consummate to the power that they're with. Yeah. And people also elect regional or local government. People also elect their MPs after, the government prorogue parliament. So this government has always centralised, has always viewed everyone else as idiotic, who aren't, pals with Dom, etc. think that's a really dangerous position to be in. And it really shows, particularly in terms of testing and tracing. I think, if we just started from a position of what is a national interest, forgetting party politics for a second, it is just so obvious that you devolve that to local councils. There's no way that someone on Whitehall can know the intricacies of tracing in Bury, or be that in Leicester as well. That has to be done locally. That just makes the most sense in terms of having the most effective results. And when that is done locally and effectively in parts of Cumbria, that has been tremendously effective. Whereas where it's been centralised, you have people sat at Serco HQ who apparently haven't contacted people at all since it was set up in June. So I think that centralising tendency is really, really dangerous for the country and for the response to COVID.
Now, one of the arguments that has been made in regard to restrictions and the imposition of the new tier system is that parts of the country, like, for example, Liverpool, Greater Manchester, are going to be put into these tiers because of the infection rate. But other areas in other parts of the country that have similar rates, or maybe not quite the same, but would apply in, for example, tier 2, haven't. Do you think that there's a certain amount of north-south divide that the government are putting areas in the north of England into higher restriction levels because they're in the north, rather than just applying it across the country and following the science as they said that they would? 100%.
So I think this is a completely southern guided strategy. If you look ultimately back to May and June and the decision to reverse a lockdown, that was because the rates had gone down in the south, particularly in London. They hadn't in the north. The virus started spreading first in London, and we all went into a national lockdown, and that was the right decision. But Andy Burnham was saying at the time, this is too soon for the north. This is too soon for Greater Manchester. The government ploughed on because I think they treat those voices with ultimately disdain. It's a strong term to use, but I think that's accurate. They ploughed on ahead and had to, because of the rate was above 1, the R rate was above 1 in June. It still was in July, which made that decision to put Greater Manchester under local lockdown, or increase the restrictions. It wasn't ever a lockdown. And that's been in place for over 100 days now and hasn't massively affected because they don't have people on the ground to say what is and isn't working. Meanwhile, they're pursuing stuff like Eat Out to help out. You almost must go back to the offices, which were massively exacerbating the crisis still. And absolutely, I mean, the rates in Boris Johnson's own constituency and the constituencies of cabinet ministers like Robert Jenrick and Gavin Williamson are higher now than Greater Manchester was when it got put into what would now be tier 2. So I think it shows that not only is there scant regard for northern communities, but also there's complete pork barrel politics, particularly with Robert Jenrick. And if you vote for this particular set of chums that run the country, they'll do you a favour, and if you don't, I'm sorry, they don't care about you.
Now, one of the potential ways out of this that has been suggested would be a circuit breaker in Northern Ireland. They've just announced that they will be going into a circuit breaker for a couple of weeks. Do you think that that's the right thing to do for the country as a whole, or do you think that that should be applied more regionally?
I think it should be the thing for the country as a whole. That's a regretful place to be. We shouldn't have to be in it. It's a massive policy failure from the government, but I do think ultimately the rates are so high now and they're increasing across the country. Jonathan Van Tam showed yesterday that's the case. So yeah, we do have to do this, but ultimately, lockdowns are important because obviously they reduce the contact that spreads the virus, but also because they allow you to get a functioning track and trace model in place. And we had 10 weeks, 12 weeks last time, and the government didn't do that. Because they privatised it off to Serco and it's not been functioning. So this time we have to make sure that when we're out of the circuit break, hopefully, that is in place to make sure that people can go out safely and know that their contacts will be traced if they do have coronavirus.
What are your thoughts on the way that the Labour Party has approached this? Of course, we've mentioned Andy Burnham, but I'm just thinking in particular, do you think that Keir Starmer has been robust enough in terms of criticising the government for the failure to get a grip of the virus?
I don't think so. I think he was right yesterday to call for the circuit breaker. I think he was right to begin this, in April when he became leader by saying we are a constructive opposition. This is an unprecedented crisis. in the few weeks since, I think he introduced himself to the public extraordinarily effectively, to great success, and COVID was a significant part of that, and his maturity in response to that and constructiveness. However, there is a limit by which point you have to still be constructive, but that criticism has to take the lead and there has to be the emphasis. And when the government has failed on stuff like track and trace, he's called it out. I do think possibly he should have been a little bit stronger in the past few weeks, but I think now that's been reversed with the correct call for a circuit breaker.
How do you feel about the leadership of the Labour Party in general? Because I remember the last time we spoke in January, it was just at the very start of the campaign, and obviously a great deal has happened since then, new leader of the Labour Party. How do you feel about the leadership in general?
I think it's going broadly well. I think from a polling perspective, it's going well in terms of Keir's introduced himself to the public. He's got very high approval ratings, extraordinarily high approval ratings, I'd say. And the party has taken, lead in some polls and has certainly bridged the gap. So I think that's good. In terms of policies, they're going to wait closer towards the general election. I understand that. I just hope that the policy platform we do end up with is very close to the 10 commitments that Keir made during the leadership election, which are really about maintaining the legacy of socialist economics. I think that's really important that he does that and maintain that socialist platform. I'm confident that he will. I really hope that he will. And it's up to us as members to try and, through our role as National Policy Forum or electing people to the National Executive, etc., and through our MPs to say, we as members want this. But equally, I think what's important is that the Labour Together report, which his office have accepted and the party looking to implement, does call for that platform to remain in place. So I am very, very happy with what's going on, but not uncritical. As I just said, I think there should be more robust in the past few weeks. And equally, policies like on Kashmir, I don't agree. And on these two bills that have come forward, that the government have introduced, I don't agree with them necessarily, but broadly I'm positive and happy with the direction.
Now, of course, we're also seeing internal elections within the Labour Party, NEC elections and Young Labour elections. I don't know how closely you've followed them, but if you have, what have been your thoughts about the way that the campaign has been conducted and the candidates that are standing? So
apologies to yourself and your viewers. I haven't followed it closely at all. I've been busy and not been on Twitter very much. I think that's the main place that they're taking part in. Although I was at my constituency party a few weeks ago, I spoke in favour of Jermaine Chapman and Anne Black being nominated as the Open Labour candidates, and I think they're two great candidates. Pleased that my CLP nominated them, which is great, and they're both on the ballot. So those are two great candidates, and apologies for not paying more.
Oh no, it's not a problem at all. I wonder, do you think that the National Executive Committee and Young Labour, do you think that the importance of them is something that has to be emphasised, regardless of whether the party is in opposition or in government? Because I know some people have felt, well, what's the point in all these internal elections when we aren't actually in government? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. I think they're arguably more important in opposition than government because we have to work towards getting to government. I think the NEC is one of the important bodies that does so. Really important body with really important range of powers that affect the party a lot. And I know it's ironic I'm saying that and I'm not paying much attention to this particular set of elections, but these are the constituency reps. It's also reps for liberation communities, for the various trade unions and socialist societies as well. And also, ones for the parliamentary party. So it's a very, very important committee. It's got a very long history in our party and in our movement. So I hope that's the case. And equally, as well as, if there's a kind of educational training about what the party does, I think that should be front and centre. But so should the regional boards within the regional Labour Party structures who kind of wielding NEC power at regional level. I think they're important too and often underemphasised by some.
Now, of course, next year we're not only having local and mayoral elections in England, we're also having devolved elections in Wales and Scotland. How do you feel about Labour's position in Wales and Scotland? Do you think that things are on track for Labour to do well in those elections?
I'll take the easy one first. I'll go for Wales. I think Mark Drakeford's doing a really good job. He's really impressive, and obviously I don't see everything because I'm on this side of the border, but I think he's been a very impressive communicator throughout the whole crisis, and certainly been impressive. Scotland, again, I speak from being south of Hadrian's Wall, so I'm not fully acquainted with all the goings on. It doesn't look good in terms of polling. But hopefully we can change that through the course of the campaign and really emphasise that there's only one route to voting for progressive politics within the union, and that's the Labour Party. It's really emphasise the former about we are the only socialist party that are operating in those elections. We're the only one who are going to redistribute power and wealth to people in Scotland, and the SNP aren't because they are Tartan Tories. And the Tories aren't because they're Tories. So I think it's really important that message emphasised, and for the many, not the few, takes a kind of central role in that campaign.
Now, one of the great issues in Scottish politics is, of course, independence. And you mentioned the SNP there, and a new poll has just come out from Ipsos Mori, which has support for independence at 58%. Support for continuation of the union, Scotland remaining in the UK at 42%. Do you think that the Labour Party should commit to an independence referendum, even if it's not something that we necessarily want to do, simply to get the issue out of the way? Or do you think that Labour should continue to perhaps not have the most pro-indie referendum position?
So in my view, the latter. I don't think we should be calling for a referendum. We are a unionist party, and we believe in collectivism beyond kind of national, within the UK perspective, national borders and loyalty. So I think we should be firm against that, but equally shift that debate beyond those constitutional questions of independence towards who operates in the interests of working people in Scotland and indeed across the country. And there's only one answer to that, and that's the Labour Party.
What are your thoughts on Richard Leonard's leadership? Because I know that there have been, from some quarters, some criticism of it. Do you think that he's doing a good job? Are there certain things that you think he needs to improve upon?
Again, I don't know too much about the internal dynamics within Scotland. I know one of the things that he struggles with is people knowing him, which is on the one hand a bad thing because you're a leader, you want to be known by the country, but equally gives him an opportunity later on in the campaign when those broadcasting rules kick in to really introduce himself properly. And I think that potentially presents us with some kind of opportunity. And I think if he delivers that message about collectivism beyond those national borders and the importance of that Labour's always played in Scotland, I think there is a way to rebuild his personal image. And also saw in a similar poll today that Keir Starmer's polling well in Scotland, so emphasise that too, and also get Gordon Brown out on the campaign trail.
Yeah, I think that would obviously help a great deal. Looking forward to 2024, what do you think the Labour Party really has to do to gain back support that it lost in areas of the north of England? And of course, it lost quite a few seats at the last election. What do you think it needs to do? Is there any one thing that it needs to do, or do you think it's a variety of things that it needs to do to get that support back?
Definitely a combination of things, but in the overarching terms, I'd say about emphasising the importance of that redistribution of economic policies, about really emphasising power. And, not just on the devolution perspective, although that's incredibly important, but also, which party operates in the interests of working people in the north and indeed across the country, and really emphasise that the Labour Party is the only party that does that. I think many of the recommendations of the Labour Together report, particularly from a policy perspective, are really good. And it's great that that's kind of united across the whole party. The commissioners on that report really stretch from across the party. I think that's really good. So I think it's emphasising that, socialist, anti-austerity, economic policy, and then also potentially emphasising that within a patriotic perspective as well. That we are proud of the country that we live in, and the Tories operate within and only service a particular elite, a particular small group of people. The idea of capital, they only finance capital and a particular elite, whereas Labour operates for the many. And the Tories' elitism is working against this country. So I think we need to emphasise the patriotism there.
Do you think that, and this has been suggested by a few people, I don't know how much you agree with it, do you think that Labour perhaps should emphasise more regional devolution to areas in the north of England, perhaps take a more federalist approach? Do you think that would gain some more support? Potentially.
I think it has to be part of a wider package in terms of, it shouldn't just be political, it should be economic as well. And really devolving that to, regional economic bodies and this investment bank that's going to be based in the north in Labour's last manifesto to reinvigorate that and bring that back. Definitely, devolution is something that can help from a policy perspective, and I think we need to win the argument for that as well. The 2004 referendum within the northeast was lost, and quite convincingly so. So we need to win an argument for that on a public level. But from my experience in knocking on doors, etc., people like Andy Burnham. They like the idea of having an Andy Burnham. And I think through kind of Labour successes at that level, be that Andy Burnham or Steve Rotherham, or indeed across Dan Jarvis across the country, we need to really emphasise that, even if the national picture isn't looking good, which I hope it will be at the next election, that Labour can still be doing stuff at local level, and actually the importance of having that local autonomy, because we are one of the most centralised countries in the world. I think we are the most centralised country in the OECD. And that has massive implications for policy making, because you've seen that with COVID and the failure to track and trace and various things really. Transport in the north is still way behind the south. If you had policymakers getting on those packed trains in the morning, they might have more of an incentive to fix them. And oddly, that's an argument that seems to be made by Michael Gove at Ditchley, his number two Theodore Agnew at the Tory conference. So maybe it might happen.
Bringing up policymakers, of course, one of the issues that has been very much influenced by policymakers at the moment is Brexit. We're seeing the internal market bill going through the House of Commons at the moment. How concerned are you about this particular piece of legislation? And what do you think will be the impact of a no-deal Brexit on the North?
So to answer the first question about the internal market bill, it's a really weird thing to do at this point of the negotiations, when the real tension between the government and the EU is about the state aid rules and about whether or not they can have a non-binding commitment that we will follow EU rules, and that's based on a particular point of trust, and that trust was lost by a reckless but also ultimately pointless decision to put this internal market bill through to break international law. It looks bad for the country, has massive implications for those negotiations with the EU. I think it's a really reckless, stupid and pointless thing to do, that bill, and I'm disappointed that the Berry MPs both voted for it and then to break international law. In terms of no deal, I think it would have significant implications. I think it would be disastrous for the country. The impact of supply chains, manufacturing, of the rights of people to move abroad, stuff like the EHIC, the medical card, animal rights even abroad. I think it would be really, really bad for this country, and I just hope in the next few weeks that we can avert that.
Moving to the other side of the Atlantic now, there's only about 20 odd days until the US presidential election. So what are your general feelings about the presidential election? Are you hopeful of a Biden victory? What do you think? Yeah.
Obviously, I hope Biden beats Trump. I'm not a massive fan of his from a personal policy perspective, but anyone's better than Trump. Almost anyone is. And Biden is certainly better than Trump. So I hope he wins. I hope he wins convincingly, and really sends a message to Donald Trump. And wouldn't it be great to see someone in the White House who isn't Trump?
How concerned at all are you? This is an issue that's been raised somewhat, at the possibility that Donald Trump challenges some of the mail-in ballots and tries to get them thrown out, so that one particular state goes from Biden to Trump and it changes the result of the election. Is that something that you're concerned about at all?
Definitely. I mean, definitely within his character to try and do that. I expected him to do that in 2016 if he lost the result, so certainly expect him to do it now. I think maybe the precedent set in 2000 with the Gore v Bush election, but also the cases that happened after that might potentially stop that from happening. But I don't think Trump's going to stop this lightly, which all the more emphasises the importance of people getting out to voting against Trump in as large numbers as possible, because that will make that result as convincing as possible, make sure that any challenge would fall flat on his face. But I do think it's really damaging for a democracy if one side of it doesn't accept the result. I think it's really damaging because you completely undermine authority, etc. I think that'd be really bad.
One of the other issues that has been prominent on the campaign trail has, of course, been the Supreme Court. And Donald Trump's attempts so far, he's not been able to do it yet, to confirm Amy Coney Barrett as a replacement for Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the Supreme Court. Some in the Democratic Party have suggested that if Biden wins, he should attempt to pack the court, which means to add extra seats to it. Do you think that this would be something that he'd have to do to ensure his legislative agenda got through unchallenged? Or do you think that it's a bad idea to politicise the court too much?
Well, I think the court's already political. I'm not sure about the internal strategic questions, but I don't see why not. Precedent, particularly set by Mitch McConnell in 2016, in not allowing Barack Obama's nominee for the Supreme Court through, has really damaged trust, I believe, in the institution and the relationship between those branches of the American government. So I think it's really important that that's reversed, and it's only fair that additional members are added, because there will be two members who are appointed in weird circumstances that shouldn't be repeated. So I think if that's redressed, that will seem fair, yeah.
We're coming towards the end of the podcast. As always, it's been great to have you on, Nathan, and I've got one final question for you. As mentioned at the start of the podcast, you're standing for election. So my question to you is this. If you are elected, what sort of victory meal would you most like to have after your victory?
Ooh, good question. I think I'd like a nice pizza, some spicy, some jalapenos and stuff on it. Like a nice local pizza from up the road. I think I deserve that. I managed to hold on to it.
Well, that sounds like a great meal. If people want to find out more about your campaign or about you, where should they go?
Sure. Unsworth Labour on Twitter and Facebook. Give us a follow. It'd be greatly appreciated. And I'm Nathan Boroda on Twitter, so we'll basically be retweeting Unsworth Labour's content anyway. We can follow both for double the content.
Excellent. Well, thank you once again for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure, anytime.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you've enjoyed it, you can subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, Podbeam, and Amazon Music. You can also follow us on Twitter, @DebatedPodcast, like us on Facebook, Debated Podcast, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, whether about appearing on an episode of the podcast or commenting on an episode that you've listened to, you can do so at thedebatedpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. I hope you listen to the next one.